Welcome guys, this tutorial is designed to refresh your memory about the different parts of a graph. So we're going to go ahead and label this parts of a graph. We're going to start our discussion by talking about the basic axes that you're going to see on a graph and that you're going to be responsible for on your assessment. So a graph will have two axes that you're responsible for knowing. There is an x-axis as well as a y-axis. The easiest way to remember which axis is which is to remind yourself that the y-axis, or the y, sounds like sky. So whenever you're trying to figure out which axis is the y, you're going to say y sky. If you think about what direction the sky is relative to where you are, it's up, or it's going vertically. So this is my y-axis, and I'm going to go ahead and say that this is the vertical axis. And if I know which one is my y, I automatically know which axis is my x because it's the only other option that I have available. So I have my y-axis and I have my x-axis. The next thing that I need to know in reference to my graph is the point where these two axes actually meet. And the point where they meet is called the origin. So I have my y-axis, I have my x-axis, and I also have my origin where these two axes actually meet. Another thing that we want to discuss is the title of the graph, and the title of the graph is really important. The title of the graph should be the very first thing that you look at when you are presented with a graph, because the title can tell us lots of different things. The title can tell us the relationship between the IV and the DV. And in fact, if we ever ask you a question, for instance, if we ask you to graph a specific set of data and then to title that graph, the way that you would title it would be to set it up this way. The effect of IV on DV. And once you identify your IV and your DV, all you have to do is plug them in, and that is a good working title for a graph. Now with that said, we need to know where we put our IV and where we put our DV. Our IV is always going to be found along the x-axis. That never changes. So our IV is always going to be placed on the x, and our DV is always going to be placed along the y. So the DV is always going to be vertical, the IV is always going to be horizontal. And let's go ahead and write that as well so that we are comfortable with those terms. The x-axis is always horizontal, or it runs in the same direction as the horizon, right? So if you're trying to look at the sun, a sun setting or a sun rising, it's the same as the horizon, running in the same direction. The next thing that I want to remind you of is in our lecture when we first introduced this idea of graphing and the important parts of a graph, we gave you a little way or a little drawing to help you remember where the IV versus the DV is actually placed along the graph. So we had you draw a mini graph that looks just like this. And then after doing that, we had you do a little bit of word art. So we turned the horizontal axis, or the x-axis, into an I, and we turned the vertical axis into a D. And when we did that, we got something that looked like this. So again, my y-axis is vertical, it's going up and down. My x-axis is horizontal, it's going left to right. And then if I turn my y-axis into a D, that reminds me that the DV is always found on the vertical axis, or it's always found on the y-axis. And then my IV, the horizontal line across the bottom, or the x-axis, is going to be the top part of my I to remind me that my IV is always placed on the horizontal axis, or the x. All right, you guys, I hope that helped. Please use this information that we just went over to help you solve the practice problems that are on your review sheet. And remember, if you have any issues, please come and see us before it's time to take your quiz. Thanks, guys.